I remember the exact moment my life ended. Not metaphorically, literally. It was a Tuesday in October, the kind of cold that seeps through your coat and settles in your bones, and I was standing in the parking lot of Meridian Capital Group, my company, watching the security guard escort me to my own car. My badge had stopped working at 7:14 a.m. By 7:20, a man named Derek, hired by my own board, had his hand on my elbow and was walking me past the lobby fountain I'd commissioned, past the reception desk where Linda had worked for 11 years and couldn't look me in the eye, and out through the revolving glass doors I'd chosen myself from a catalog in 2019. I sat in my car for 40 minutes without starting the engine. My name is Henry Callaway. I built Meridian Capital from a spreadsheet on a folding table in a one-bedroom apartment in Columbus, Ohio. By the time I was 34, the company managed $2.3 billion in assets. By 37, we had offices in 4 cities, a client list that included 2 Fortune 500 companies, and a profile in Forbes that my mother had laminated and kept on her refrigerator. I wasn't born wealthy. My father drove a delivery truck. My mother was a school librarian. Everything I had, I built with 15-hour days and a level of obsessive focus that had cost me 2 relationships before I finally, at 31, met Megan Hartwell at a charity auction in Cincinnati and believed, genuinely believed, that I had finally found the one person in the world who loved me, not what I had built. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about almost everything. The story of how Megan's family took everything from me, framed me for fraud, had me arrested, stripped me of my company, my home, my reputation, and eventually arranged for me to be left for dead in a situation so calculated and so cold that I still wake up some nights unable to breathe. That story starts the way all the worst stories start, with love, with trust, with me handing over every defense I had because I never imagined I would need them. Megan was beautiful in a way that felt accidental, like she didn't know what she looked like or didn't care. She had dark red hair and a laugh that came from her stomach and opinions about everything from monetary policy to the best way to make biscuits. She was a landscape architect. She designed parks and green spaces for cities, and she talked about soil composition and native plants the way I talked about market volatility, with complete absorption. I fell for her in about 11 minutes. We were married 2 years later at a vineyard in Virginia. Her father, Richard Hartwell, gave a toast that made half the room cry. Richard Hartwell. If I close my eyes right now, I can still see him the way I saw him that first year, big, barrel-chested, silver-haired, the kind of man who shook your hand and made you feel like you'd passed a test. He ran Hartwell Development, a regional real estate firm that had done well enough to give his family a comfortable, upper-middle-class life but nothing extraordinary. He had 3 children, Megan, her older brother Greg, and her younger sister Christine. Greg was a sales manager for a pharmaceutical company. Christine was perpetually between jobs and perpetually borrowing money. They were a tight family, which I liked. I came from a tight family. I thought I understood what that meant. What it meant, I would learn, was something else entirely. In the 3rd year of our marriage, I made Richard an offer that was more generosity than strategy. Hartwell Development was hemorrhaging money. Richard had overleveraged on a commercial real estate project in Indianapolis that went sideways when the anchor tenant pulled out. He needed a capital infusion of about $4 million or he would lose everything: the firm, his house, his retirement. I gave it to him as a personal loan, below market rate, structured so he could repay it over 8 years without straining himself. Megan cried when I told her. She held my face in her hands and said she had never loved me more than she did in that moment. I should have made him sign a personal guarantee. I didn't. It felt wrong to do that to family. Over the next 3 years, I folded my trust into the Hartwell family like it was the most natural thing in the world. I hired Greg as a consultant on 2 Meridian projects at rates that were frankly embarrassing given his output. I paid Christine's legal bills when she had a dispute with a former landlord. I bought Richard a membership at his golf club for Christmas. I let Megan bring her father into 3 conversations about Meridian's strategy because she said he found purpose in feeling useful. And somewhere in those 3 years, while I was busy running a company and loving my wife and feeling genuinely, stupidly grateful for the life I had built, the Hartwell family was building something else entirely. They were building a case against me. I found out on a Tuesday, as I said, but the Tuesday was actually the end of something that had been constructed for months. What I would later piece together, sitting in a county jail cell and then in a series of increasingly grim motel rooms, living on what was left on a prepaid card I'd kept in the glove compartment, was this: Richard had used his access to Meridian's internal discussions to fabricate evidence of financial misconduct. Greg had connections at the regulatory body that oversaw our industry and had fed them doctored documents suggesting I had been moving client funds through shell accounts. Christine, who I had always dismissed as flaky and harmless, turned out to be the sharpest of them. She had spent 8 months cultivating a relationship with 2 members of my board of directors, men I had trusted absolutely, and had convinced them that the evidence against me was real and that their only path to protecting Meridian and themselves was to act before the regulators went public. And Megan. My wife, the woman whose face I had looked at across a pillow for 6 years. Megan had signed documents that, I later discovered, transferred her proxy votes on my shares of Meridian to a holding company that Richard controlled. She had done this 4 months before I was escorted out of my own building. She had been in bed with me every one of those nights. She had kissed me goodbye every one of those mornings. She had texted me heart emojis from the road when she was traveling for work. I don't have a word for what that feels like. I have tried to find one and I can't. The arrest came 8 days after I was removed from Meridian. 2 federal agents knocked on the door of the house Megan and I owned in Dublin, Ohio, a house I had designed, where I had planted an apple tree in the backyard because Megan said she'd always wanted one, and informed me that I was being charged with securities fraud, wire fraud, and misappropriation of client assets. Megan stood in the kitchen doorway watching them put zip ties on my wrists. She didn't say a word. She didn't cry. She watched with an expression I had never seen on her face before, and it took me several days in a cell to identify what it was. Relief. My lawyer, a man named Patrick Brennan who had done my corporate work for years and who I trusted with the same blind generosity I had applied to everything in my life, informed me on day 2 that he had a conflict of interest and would be withdrawing from my representation. What he did not tell me, what I found out later, was that Richard Hartwell had retained him 3 weeks earlier for a consulting engagement that conveniently made it impossible for Patrick to represent me. I was assigned a public defender who was competent and overworked and who believed approximately 40% of what I told him. Bail was set at $800,000. My accounts had been frozen. My assets were under a court order. Megan did not post bail. Her father did not post bail. Nobody posted bail. I sat in county lockup for 19 days while Patrick's replacement fought to get the bail reduced and Meridian's new interim CEO, a man who had been in the building for less than a month and who I strongly suspected was Richard's candidate, began dismantling everything I had built. I was eventually released on bond, ordered to surrender my passport, and told to report weekly. I moved into the cheapest apartment I could rent with the last of what was in a personal savings account the freeze hadn't reached. $7,400. I bought a used laptop and a prepaid phone and started trying to figure out how to save my life. It was during that period, 3 months of grinding, sleepless, furious investigation, that I discovered the full architecture of what had been done to me. And it was during that period that I understood, with a clarity that cut through every other feeling I'd had, that sadness was a luxury I could not afford. What I had instead was something colder and more useful. I was going to bury every single one of them. Let me tell you about the buried alive part, because I've been building to it and you deserve to know. 6 weeks after my release on bond, I received a message from Greg asking to meet. He said he was having second thoughts. He said he hadn't understood the full scope of what his father was doing and that his conscience was eating him alive. He suggested a location, an old property that Hartwell Development owned outside of Lancaster, Ohio, a farmhouse that had been sitting vacant for 2 years, pending sale. He said he had documents. He said he was ready to give me everything I needed to blow the whole thing open. I should have known. A man who has been wrong about everything important does not suddenly develop the judgment to smell a trap. I drove out there on a Thursday evening in February, told nobody where I was going, a decision that still makes my stomach drop when I think about it, and walked into a farmhouse where Greg was waiting with 2 other men I'd never seen before. There was no meeting. There were no documents. What happened next happened fast. I was struck from behind, and I woke up in darkness that was total and suffocating, with dirt walls around me and no light anywhere and the understanding, arriving in a wave of animal terror so complete it erased every other thought, that I was in the ground. It was a pit. Maybe 6 feet deep, 4 feet square, with rough wooden boards across the top that had been covered with enough dirt and debris to muffle sound. I found out later, much later, that it was on a section of the Hartwell property that had been designated for a drainage project, which meant the disturbed ground would look routine. They had planned for me to simply disappear. A fugitive from fraud charges, widely covered in local news, who ran and was never found. The bond would be forfeited. The case would proceed in absentia. Meridian would be fully absorbed. Richard Hartwell would have won completely. I spent 4 hours in that hole. I want to say I was calm and methodical, but the truth is I screamed until my throat gave out, and then I was calm and methodical. The wooden boards were old. The screws holding the latching mechanism were corroded. I had my car keys in my pocket. They hadn't checked carefully enough, and I used the serrated edge of the key to work at the wood around one of the screws for 2.5 hours until it gave. The rest was adrenaline and the most primal version of rage I have ever felt. I came up out of that ground at 11 p.m. with dirt in my lungs and blood on my hands and a new understanding of what I was dealing with. These people had tried to kill me, not ruin me, kill me. I walked 4 miles to a gas station, bought water and used the bathroom to clean up enough to function, and then called the only person I trusted, my college roommate Tom Briggs, who lived in Indianapolis and who had no connection to Meridian or the Hartwells and who, when I told him I needed help and couldn't explain everything yet, said only, "Tell me where you are." Tom picked me up at 2 a.m. I sat in his car and shook for about 20 minutes, and then I stopped shaking and I told him everything. And then I told him what I needed. What I needed was a forensic accountant, a private investigator, a good securities attorney, and enough time before my next check-in with my bond conditions to begin building a countercase so airtight that when I surfaced, there would be nowhere left for any of them to go. Tom, it turned out, had been building a decent life since college. He was a partner at a regional private equity firm. He could not help me officially, the legal exposure was too significant, but unofficially, quietly, he could connect me with people, and he could front me money. Not charity, he made clear, alone, with the expectation that when I came back, I would come back fully. You're not going to just survive this, he told me that night, in the spare bedroom of his house in Carmel. You're going to come back so hard that they'll wish they'd left you in the ground. I want to give Tom Briggs a monument someday. Over the next 6 months, I did not exist, officially. I missed a bond check-in, which technically made me a fugitive, though the attorney Tom connected me with, a woman named Joan Whitfield, out of Chicago, who specialized in financial crimes and wrongful prosecution and who had a reputation in the legal community that bordered on mythological, was quietly working to address that. The argument she was building was that I had credible evidence that the people who arranged my prosecution had also attempted to murder me, and that my disappearance was not flight but self-preservation. It was a complex argument that required the evidence to actually exist. So we built the evidence. The private investigator Tom connected me with was a former FBI agent named Ray Dooley, 58 years old, half-deaf in his left ear, and possibly the most thorough human being I have ever encountered. Ray spent 3 months building a dossier on the Hartwell family that accounted for every financial transaction, every communication, every meeting, every lie. He had sources inside Hartwell Development, a bookkeeper named Angela who had been quietly horrified by what she'd witnessed and needed only the guarantee of legal protection to talk. He had communications records obtained through channels I didn't examine too closely, and he had Greg Hartwell, it turned out, had not been entirely lying when he said his conscience was bothering him. He had arranged the farmhouse meeting under his father's orders. But after whatever those 2 men did to make sure I was in the ground and the ground was covered, Greg had come apart quietly. He started drinking heavily. He stopped returning his father's calls. Ray found him in a bar in Columbus 6 weeks into his investigation, and spent 3 evenings with him before Greg, understanding that I was alive and that I had a lawyer and that the entire structure of what his family had built was about to be examined by professionals, agreed to cooperate. Greg gave us everything: the timeline of the fraud construction, the names of the 2 men who had been at the farmhouse, recordings he had kept, because Greg, for all his moral failure, had been scared enough to record conversations as insurance. His father directing him, Christine coordinating with the board members, and Megan. I need to stay with Megan for a moment because this is the part one have to say accurately or I'll carry it wrong for the rest of my life. Megan knew. Not every detail, I believe, and Joan eventually argued successfully, that Megan was not aware of the farmhouse, not aware that her father intended to have me killed rather than simply imprisoned and ruined. But she knew about the fraud fabrication. She knew about the share transfer. She had signed documents in full knowledge that they were designed to strip me of my company. She had watched them put zip ties on my wrists with relief because she had known it was coming, and she had chosen her family over the truth, over me, over 6 years of a marriage I thought was real. She had a reason, which Greg eventually told Ray, which Ray told me. Richard had promised Megan a significant portion of the proceeds from the Meridian acquisition, the sale of the company's assets once I was out of the picture, and had told her that Henry had been cheating the company for years, that it was only a matter of time before it collapsed and took everything they had with it. Whether Megan believed this, whether she convinced herself it was true because believing it made what she was doing survivable, I genuinely do not know. It doesn't change anything, but I think about it sometimes. Joan's legal strategy was a masterpiece of precision. She did not surface me until the moment every piece was in place: Greg's sworn testimony, Angela's documentation, Ray's recordings, a forensic accounting report from a firm in New York that systematically dismantled every fabricated transaction and traced its origin directly back to Richard Hartwell's own hand. Joan also coordinated, quietly, with the FBI, not the local office, which had conducted the original investigation, but a unit in Washington that specialized in financial crimes and corporate fraud. When she presented them with what we had, the shift was immediate. I surfaced on a Monday morning in September, 14 months after I had disappeared from that gas station. I walked into the FBI field office in Columbus with Joan Whitfield on my left and Tom Briggs on my right and 4 bankers' boxes of evidence in a cart behind us. I had lost 20 pounds in the prior year and gained it back as muscle because the only thing I could control was what I did with my body every morning. I was wearing a suit Tom had bought me. I was completely calm. The agents in that office had last seen my name on a fugitive warrant. By the end of that afternoon, the warrant was suspended, pending, and then quietly withdrawn. By the following morning, the FBI had begun executing search warrants on Hartwell Development's offices and Richard Hartwell's home. By the end of that week, Richard Hartwell, Greg Hartwell, Christine Hartwell, and 2 board members of Meridian Capital Group, the men Christine had cultivated, were all under federal investigation. Patrick Brennan, my former lawyer, was referred to the state bar. Now let me tell you about the first time I saw Megan again. It was a Tuesday, which felt appropriate. It was at the federal courthouse in Columbus, a preliminary hearing on the charges against her father. Joan had advised me I didn't need to be there. I went anyway. She was in the corridor outside the courtroom. She had aged in 14 months in a way that had nothing to do with years and everything to do with what it costs to carry a secret that size. Her hair, which she had always kept long, was cut short. She was thinner. She was wearing a coat I didn't recognize. All her clothes, all her choices, were now things I didn't recognize, and I suppose mine were too, to her. She saw me and stopped moving. People flowed around her in the corridor. She stared at me with an expression that I had enough distance now to read clearly. It was shame, and it was terror, and underneath both of those, with a flicker I caught and then watched her suppress, it was something that might once have been love and was now only a reminder of what she had destroyed. I looked at her for a long moment. Joan was behind me with her hand very lightly on my arm. "Henry," Megan said. "Just my name. Nothing else." "I heard you got served yesterday," I said. This was true. Her lawyers had been notified that she was a named party in a civil suit I had filed, separate from the federal criminal case. "I hope you kept all those documents you signed. You're going to need them." I walked past her into the courtroom. I did not look back. I want to tell you it felt good. It felt like something, which is different. It felt like putting down a weight I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. The federal cases moved through the system over the following 18 months with a thoroughness that I watched with something approaching wonder. Richard Hartwell pleaded not guilty initially, then, as the evidence piled up in ways his lawyers could not navigate, entered a plea agreement 9 months into the process that resulted in 7 years in federal prison, disgorgement of assets, and a restitution order that effectively ended Hartwell development as a going concern. The company was liquidated. The Indianapolis property that had started the whole chain, the reason Richard had come to me for money in the first place, was eventually sold at a loss that swallowed the last of what he'd built. Christine, who had been the most surgical of all of them and who had made the mistake of keeping meticulous digital records of everything because she was, at her core, a control freak who didn't trust anyone to remember the details, received 5 years, also federal. She was out in 3.5. I hear she's in Phoenix now. I don't track her. Greg cooperated fully and received a deferred prosecution, no prison time, a substantial fine, 3 years of supervised release. I have a complicated relationship with what I feel about Greg. He put me in the ground. He also got me out of it, in a different way. I think he will spend the rest of his life trying to reconcile those 2 facts about himself. That's his work to do, not mine. The 2 men from the farmhouse, their names were Eddie Marsh and Carl Voss, and they were contract workers Hartwell Development had used on various projects, men who apparently understood that a certain kind of side work was available if you didn't ask questions, were charged with attempted murder, kidnapping, and unlawful imprisonment. Marsh took a deal. Voss went to trial. Both are in prison in Ohio. I have not thought about them in some time. They were tools of people who had made choices, and the tools have been disposed of. Megan, my wife, the woman I married. She was not charged criminally. Joan and the prosecutors went back and forth on this, and ultimately the decision was that while Megan had knowingly signed documents that facilitated the fraud, the evidence of her direct participation in the planning of the fraud itself was insufficient for a criminal charge that would survive. She was, on paper, a spouse who had signed things her father told her to sign and who may or may not have fully understood their implications. Joan privately told me this was a fiction, and that everyone involved knew it, but that the criminal case against Richard and Christine was strong and adding a marginal prosecution of Megan would only complicate it. The civil case was a different matter. In civil court, the standard is preponderance of the evidence, not beyond a reasonable doubt. And in civil court, Joan was a different kind of animal, precise, relentless, document by document, laying out every decision Megan had made, every signature, every timeline. Megan's attorneys tried to argue she had been manipulated by her father, that she was a victim too, that she hadn't understood the full picture. Joan dismantled this, point by point, over 4 days of testimony that I attended in full, sitting at the plaintiff's table, watching my ex-wife. The divorce had been finalized 8 months earlier, with Megan receiving almost nothing given the circumstances, try to explain herself. I will say this, she tried. On the 3rd day of her testimony, she looked directly at me for the first time since the corridor and she said, in a voice that broke about halfway through, that she was sorry, that she had told herself things that weren't true and had let her father convince her that what they were doing was necessary, that she had lost the best person in her life and that she deserved to have lost him. I had no response to give her. Not because I was cold, but because I had spent the better part of 2 years trying to build something specific out of my anger, and I did not want to contaminate it with sentiment in a courtroom. I looked at her steadily, the way you look at something that no longer has the power to hurt you, and I turned back to face forward. The civil judgment was $4.2 million. She doesn't have it. She has been paying it down for years and will be doing so for a long time. Now let me tell you about Meridian. While all of this was happening in the courts, Joan had been doing something else simultaneously, challenging the legitimacy of the share transfer, the board actions, and the subsequent sale of Meridian's assets to a holding company that, unsurprisingly, had Richard Hartwell's fingerprints on its ownership structure. This was a separate legal effort and it was enormously complex and it took almost 2 years to fully resolve. But the core argument was sound. The transfer of my voting shares had been obtained through fraud, the board actions taken on the basis of fabricated evidence were invalid, and the subsequent sale of assets had been conducted by parties who had a material interest in the outcome and who had not disclosed that interest. The resolution was not a perfect restoration. The company that had existed, Meridian Capital Group as I had built it, was gone. The client relationships had moved on. Some key staff had left. What was recovered was the assets, the capital, the real financial infrastructure, and a court order that effectively declared the entirety of the hostile takeover invalid. I spent 6 months deciding what to do with it. What I did was this: I built something new. Not Meridian, exactly, but built from its bones. I hired Joan to help me structure it. She had earned a piece of whatever I built, and she accepted a small equity stake with the kind of grace that told me she'd been hoping I'd offer it. I brought back Linda from reception, who had not been able to look me in the eye the morning they walked me out. She called me the day the news broke about my return and cried on the phone for 10 minutes before I could get a word in. I recruited several of the analysts who had left when things went sideways and who had continued to follow the case. I contacted 3 former Meridian clients who had maintained assets under our original management and who had been making do with alternatives and were not entirely happy about it. The new company was called Callaway Capital. Smaller at first, more careful. Built on different foundations, not just legal ones, but structural ones. Governance structures that made what had happened to Meridian impossible to replicate. Board members who had gone through Ray Dooley's version of a background check, which was exhaustive in a way that might have seemed paranoid before I spent 4 hours in the ground and now seemed like basic diligence. I moved to Chicago. Columbus held too much. Joan was there, and Tom flew in regularly, and I found a neighborhood I liked in an apartment where I could see the lake from the kitchen window, and I built a routine that felt, slowly, incrementally, like a life. I want to tell you about the morning I ran into Greg. It was 14 months after my return, and I was back in Columbus for a deposition in a related civil matter. I was at a coffee shop near the courthouse, reading on my phone, and Greg Hartwell sat down across from me. He had not called ahead. He had, I think, been watching the coffee shop and waiting. He looked like a man who had spent over a year being eaten by something. He was still Greg, same build, same dark hair, though there was gray in it now, but whatever confidence he'd had, whatever ease, was gone. He looked like someone who'd been taken apart and reassembled slightly wrong. "I know you don't owe me anything," he said. "That's correct," I said. "I just wanted to say it to your face." He put his hands on the table. They were shaking slightly. "I'm sorry, Henry. What I did, what I let happen, there's nothing I can say that covers it. I know that, but I needed to say it to you directly." I looked at him for a long time. I thought about the farmhouse. I thought about the dark. I thought about every night I'd spent in Tom's spare bedroom trying to understand how I had been so fundamentally wrong about people I had loved. "I know you are," I said finally. "I believe you. But understanding it doesn't mean you deserve anything from me. It just means I don't have to carry hating you." He nodded. He left. I went back to my coffee. I don't think I'll see Greg again. I think he's trying to become someone his conscience can live with. That might happen for him or it might not. It's not mine to resolve. Hartwell Development, as I mentioned, was liquidated. The Indianapolis property, the original sin, the project that had started all of this, the thing that had made Richard desperate enough to plot against me, was eventually acquired by a development group in the process of building out a mixed-use commercial district in the area. The development group was Callaway Capital's first real estate investment vertical. I own that property now. I think about that sometimes and I feel something that isn't quite satisfaction and isn't quite irony and is maybe the closest thing to justice feeling like a physical object. The golf club membership I had bought Richard, his name was removed from the rolls 18 months ago. The club sent me a courtesy note. I didn't respond. I am 39 years old now. Callaway Capital manages $400 million in assets, which is not what Meridian was at its peak but is something I built from nothing for the second time, which means I know I can do it, which is a different kind of wealth than the number suggests. Tom Briggs is on my advisory board. Joan Whitfield is general counsel. Ray Dooley does our executive background checks. I am not in a relationship. I'm not close to it. But I spent 6 years married to someone who looked at me across a pillow every morning and was helping to destroy me, and that requires a certain kind of reconstruction that doesn't happen on a schedule. I go to therapy every other week with a woman named Dr. Kim Okafor who is sharp and funny and who told me, in our second session, that survival is not the same as recovery and that I should not confuse the two. I've been thinking about that distinction ever since. My mother still has the Forbes article on her refrigerator, the laminated one from when I was 34. She has also kept, I noticed when I visited last Christmas, a printout of a more recent article, from a business publication in Chicago, that ran 6 months after Callaway Capital's launch. The headline called me a comeback story. She hadn't laminated that one yet. I think she's waiting to see what else I do before she decides it's the version she wants to keep. She's probably right to wait. Last month, I went back to the Lancaster property. The farmhouse is still there. The Hartwell development estate had included it in the asset liquidation, and it had gone through 2 owners and was currently vacant again. I drove out there alone on a Sunday morning. I parked where I had parked that February night and I walked to the back of the property, past the overgrown drainage area, and I stood where I believed the pit had been. The ground had been disturbed and resettled and grown over, and there was nothing remarkable about it. It looked like any other patch of Ohio farmland. I stood there for about 10 minutes. I thought about the darkness and the screaming and the 2.5 hours of working at a corroded screw with a car key. I thought about what I had been then and what I was now. I thought about whether I had anything left to say to the version of myself that had been in that ground. What I decided was, no. That version of me said everything that needed to be said. He said it by getting out. I walked back to my car. I drove back to the highway. I had a call with a client at noon and a dinner with Tom that evening, and the next morning I had an early flight back to Chicago, to the apartment with the lake view, to the life I had rebuilt from the ground up, a phrase that, under the circumstances, I try to use with some precision. I did not look back at the farmhouse as I drove away. I didn't need to. I had done what I came to do. I had stood there and felt nothing that wasn't mine to feel, and I had walked away upright, which is the only posture that matters now. The ground couldn't hold me, and neither could they.